those of you who watch television from time to time, she is very passionate about, framing an economy versus innovation and trying to structure it in such a way that it facilitates innovation for public good. And I just discovered recently that she has done a lot of work, started to do a lot of work on healthcare and innovation in healthcare. And obviously within this topic today of affordable medicines, this is an important issue. So Mariana, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's actually great to be in this room because we host a lecture series here through the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose called Innovation in the Welfare State, which is all about trying to break down this myth that you have kind of innovation and wealth and value created in one place, the Silicon Valley kind of places in the world, and then you just have the state kind of redistributing those goods, or at best enabling, de-risking, facilitating, all these really boring words. What does it actually look like when these two worlds come together? So how we think about, ambitiously, about healthcare could actually drive the innovation itself. And I direct and founded this Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose in order to actually bring this concept, which kind of doesn't exist in economics, of public value and public purpose back at the center of political economy, and actually to contest the word value when it occurs. So in your world, value-based pricing is not just problematic in the sense of the prices it leads to, but the underlying assumptions of how value is created on top of which it's underpinned. And similarly with maximizing shareholder value, it's not just problematic in the sense of how it leads to short-termism and speculation and all sorts of issues, part of which I'll be discussing, but also the underlying theory of value, which maximizing shareholder value assumes. Anyway, so the word value enough here. And so we're doing this also, as we're doing it kind of rigorously through research and thought leadership and training, new masters in public administration, we're actually trying to change the storytelling, the narratives, the discourse around it. There's such a hold on the story about value, which is being, if you want, told and retold, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry. And so in terms of the policy world, this notion that at best you're there to fix things like market failures when they happen kind of misses what's actually happened in the world of health, but also, of course, in the digital revolution, where ambitious public actors, as well as other actors in the system, obviously the private sector, but also increasingly the third sector, so the philanthropic community, that when they're actually governed in particular ways, but also relate to each other in ambitious, symbiotic ways, you can co-create value. You don't just wait for value to be, or markets to kind of mess up and then come in and fix them. Anyway, so again, changing the vocabulary away from de-risking towards welcoming uncertainty, away from just picking winners, one technology, one sector, towards actually picking those that are willing to actually engage with really ambitious public goals, as ambitious as getting to the moon and back again. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is present this report, which is free online, just Google People's Prescription, which was funded partly by the Open Society Foundation, which funds actually a whole project around public value and public purpose in health inside our institute. Henry Lee is here. He's the postdoc funded by the grant, and he has a bunch of copies of this if you want actually a hard copy. But also we're setting up a whole kind of health innovation hub through the Open Society Foundation, collaborating with people like Aaron Kesselheim, who you might know at Harvard. So if you're interested, please bother Henry afterwards. Unfortunately, I have not unfortunately, fortunately I have 4 children. Unfortunately, 2 of them are sick, so I'm going to have to run off after this. And so what the report actually tries to do is first kind of make a hardcore diagnosis of all the ways that the system is problematic, which I assume you've been rehearsing this morning. So both in terms of the direction of innovation, the rate of innovation, the accessibility of the things that emerge from innovation systems, but also the governance structures. And I'll be going through those 4 points in a minute, but it especially puts forward a positive kind of proactive agenda, not as kind of pie in the sky utopia, but actually what can we learn from innovation systems when they were actually structured in more interesting and ambitious ways, when you really did have public, private, third sector coming together to do this kind of moonshot approaches. So I'll be talking about a mission-oriented approach to health innovation. Some obvious stuff I'm going to jump over because I don't have to tell this community why we need to be delinking innovation funding from high prices. But this issue of conditionality, in a sector where there's so much public money and third sector money going into the system, what are the conditions attached in terms of those 4 areas of directionality, rate, governance? And this whole issue about governance structures. I heard that you spoke a bit about shareholder value this morning, but there are plenty of other ways to set up companies that are benefiting massively from public funds. And these public funds are high, right? Very high. This is not a sector that's kind of doing its own thing, with atomistic companies, whether they're in garages or large R&D labs. This is a sector that just in the US gets last year got $37 billion from Uncle Sam, so the taxpayer. That's a lot of money. That's second after the Department of Defense. Third after health is Department of Energy, which has organizations like ARPA-E, which recently tried to emulate DARPA, which, as you know, came up with the internet, not a bad thing. So what do we actually know about how governance decisions are made within these public institutions, and what do we actually mean by a public return on a public investment in an area like health? How is it thought about? And also similar amounts of funding worldwide in terms of percentage of GDP. In the US, a combination of in the UK, of public and in terms of government and charity, and more classic government financing makes up about half the R&D in the sector. And so just quickly on the diagnosis, there's a problem on directionality. So in an area that does receive so much public money, to what degree are these funds actually directed at really important areas, both within the drugs, so the whole AMR issue, so too little in antibiotics, but also other non-drug areas. The work of John Abrams has highlighted how there's not enough going into diagnostics, surgical treatments, healthy living. That should be a very open debate given the amount of public money that is going in. Second, the rate. This is quite interesting because it's not just an inefficiency problem, but the way that patents have evolved. We shouldn't just get rid of patents. We should also really document just how problematic the patents are. The fact that they're so upstream, increasingly upstream, so that the tools for research are being patented, that the patents are too wide and too strong. Those are the problems. So a functioning patent system, if we wanted one, would have narrow, weak patents, not wide, strong ones. And this has hurt the type of collaboration. It especially, by the way, hurts developing countries, which often innovate by first at least imitating research done elsewhere. And when we're patenting upstream, we kind of go back to the Middle Ages, where secrecy runs things. And of course, there's this issue about the rate, literally in terms of the amount of actual drugs themselves coming out of an increasingly costly system. But I think sometimes the obsession about the rate kind of misses those other issues I just raised. Access, drugs like the hepatitis C one, which again I hear you talked about this morning, which basically was generated after 10 years of huge amounts of public funding, and then gets sold for $84,000 for a 12-week course by Gilead. Those kinds of issues are very problematic, and this is why Goldman Sachs very honestly says, well, perhaps, the whole business model in this sector is problematic. So curing patients is a bad business model, given how much the system itself is relying on these out-of-reach prices. But this issue here, the last one, on financialisation and what I called before governance, I think has been looked at a bit less. Globally, for all the sectors in the Fortune 500, the figure is that there's been about $3 trillion been used for just buying back shares, which boost stock prices, stock options, executive pay. Again, you could say, well, let them do what they want, but especially in sectors like energy and pharma, which are the two largest buybackers, these are two sectors that receive huge, subsidies, guarantees, and public investments of the type that I just mentioned, like $37 billion a year just from the NIH. This kind of lack of reinvestment back into the system due to the share buybacks, but also increasingly in the more certain and kind of Me Too type of areas, that is a problem. But so in the pharmaceutical industry, just in the last 10 years, $300 billion having been used to maximize share prices. And so what we do in the report is just to say, look, you're not going to change any of these four problems about direction, rate, access, and governance just by tinkering with the system. Let's actually use a different lens, a different framework through which to look at the problems in the system outside of a market fixing framework towards what we call market co-creating, market shaping. And that's sort of how we structure the report. So much more focus on the policy-making institutions and the government funds, and that would include charities, less about just kind of passively repairing little bits here and there, simply funding what's not being financed by the private sector, and much more as an entrepreneurial actor. This also comes from a book that I wrote called The Entrepreneurial State, which kind of mapped out the active state investments, directed investments, which got us things like Silicon Valley, everything in your iPhone, if you have one, a smartphone that makes it smart, not stupid, was government financed, internet, touchscreen, Siri, GPS. So that's not just about fixing a market failure. That has been, public funds as a co-investor alongside the private investors, less a focus on appropriability, more on accessibility, less just about de-risking, but really sharing risks and sharing the rewards. But what does sharing rewards actually look like? What are the examples? Less on short-term finance and more on patient, long-term, committed, mission-oriented finance. And just quickly, one thing I've done recently with the European Commission, a special advisor for Carlos Moedas, who's the competition commissioner in Europe, forget Brexit for a moment, just pretend we're all in this kind of together, was to write a report called Mission-Oriented Innovation, which kind of asked what if we actually transformed the current kind of blah, blah ways that we talk about challenge-led innovation towards something more real, mission-oriented innovation, looking again at the kind of moonshot approach, but then actually applying it not just to a technological feat like going to the moon was, but to social and societal challenges. Going to the moon, as you know, first of all, it was really difficult. It was a big inspirational goal, but required many different sectors. It was not just aeronautics. It was also investments in nutrition, textiles, materials, as well as aeronautics. But also what was interesting was government literally transformed its tentacles in the system, like procurement policy, not just to fund cute little SMEs, small, medium enterprises, but actually to welcome, to crowd in those organizations that were willing to kind of go after these different targets that would help you get to that mission. So really using prize schemes, grants, procurement policy to, get all sorts of bottom up, not top down. We know top down doesn't work. The state doesn't always have to mean top down, but bottom up experimentation, exploration to fill that goal. And this, by the way, has been voted on. It's nice when you write a book and people talk about the book, but it's even better if it becomes law. This report led to the European Council and the European Parliament voting on this concept of missions to replace the kind of blah, blah challenge word that was previously in the Horizon framework. And now 1/3 of the Horizon budget will be going towards some missions that they have, that they're setting out. But how you do it is where it becomes quite hard. How do you really welcome that experimentation, exploration? Who sets the mission? Is it kind of a Kennedy top-down thing, or do we actually really interact with movements, social movements, like the Energy Wende mission did in Germany, where the green movement kind of fought for 30 years for sustainability, and Merkel kind of brilliantly transformed it into a very concrete goal. What does it mean to really work in a horizontal way and listen, literally with empathy, to social movements around care, healthcare, to also be voices at the table for any health-related missions. And what's interesting is that, if you do look at a mission-oriented approach, like all the mission-oriented financing that I mentioned, financed everything that's smart and not stupid in your iPhone, that required agencies, particular organizations that themselves were mission-led. So you will have heard of DARPA, fundamental to the internet. I already just mentioned ARPA-E, which has been fundamental to the biggest innovation in battery storage in the last 5 years. And there's been kind of in the drawer this idea of a HARPA, or ARPA-H, that hasn't actually happened yet. And we interviewed Jeffrey Ling, who had been speaking to us, just read some of our work, and we said, well, take it out of the drawer and let's start actually experimenting with it. Otherwise, a mission-oriented policy without mission-oriented organizations won't work. But the ideas are, let's also learn from that DARPA model, which is you work through procurement. This isn't, again, just public money thrown at things. You work through the tentacles of, the different departments, in this case, Department of Health, but not only, to also buy in all sorts of interesting bottom-up innovations, but with a public goal. You bring in scientists for 5 years, you tell them to be crazy, be hungry and foolish, as Steve Jobs told the Stanford graduating class. Civil servants are not usually told to be hungry and foolish and welcome risk-taking. Don't worry if you screw up, get up and experiment again, as the VC guys like to describe themselves, venture capitalists. So actively co-creating markets, having a milestone-driven and timeline-constrained approach, but with milestones, knowing when to turn the tap off is just as important as turning it on. Active risk-taking, and you're actually rewarded for that risk-taking instead of losing your job. Flat, nimble, non-bureaucratic structure to ensure efficiency. Anyway, it's in the door. They just haven't sort of implemented it, which is interesting. Delinking innovation funding from high prices. I won't say anything except to say it's kind of the obvious thing to do. And there are many examples of where this can be done through prize schemes. Again, it's worked very well for other sectors, but what does it mean to actually look at how these prize schemes work with a very concrete public goal guaranteeing the failure, but also when their successes, making really sure that the benefits of those who invested in the prizes and the outcomes that come from that really are shared in ways that achieve that public reward. This, I think, is probably the most interesting part of the report, where from page 39 onwards, we look at different ways to achieve that public return through more interesting relationships between public and private. So this lack of or problematic levels of reinvestment or an investment into easy, me too kind of areas versus a higher risk areas, which really do need to be shared between different actors, that's what got us Bell Labs. So Bell Labs, as you might know, really important R&D laboratory inside AT&T, a private company, didn't just come up because AT&T one day decided to do it. It was forced into existence. So to retain its monopoly status, AT&T had to reinvest its profits back into the real economy, innovation, big innovation beyond telecoms. So why not? So instead of just throwing $37 billion into the system, some levels of conditions around that, conditions on knowledge sharing, conditions on transparency of R&D costs, conditions on access and affordability. When the Bayh-Dole Act came about in 1980, allowing publicly funded research to be patented, before that the idea was it's public funds, it should remain in the public domain. There's actually something in the act itself that says for those drugs that are public or highly publicly financed, of course, the government should retain marching rights for those drugs. So the government should be able to also set the price, not just as a regulator, intervener, meddling in the prices, but because you've co-created the drugs, of course you should have a say on the price. The US government has never exercised its right. That's why, by the way, at the beginning I said we need a new narrative, new stories. It's those lack of stories being told, even in countries that do finance this stuff properly, which then doesn't help the civil servants also to have the confidence to negotiate the right deal given the levels of public investment. There's a real kind of insecurity crisis. I sometimes think we need the therapists to come in, not just better economics. And this whole issue of governance models, maximizing shareholder value isn't the only way. Huawei, which is in the news, as you know, for in the telecom sector, is a cooperative. The Chinese economy is experimenting actually quite a bit with cooperatives. There's different ways to set up governance structures, but surely in an area where which has so much public funds, a stakeholder governance model of the companies themselves could be quite relevant. So instead of falling back to the 1970s discussion of private versus public, nationalization, Corbyn apparently wants to nationalize some of these pharmaceutical companies, as however does Jim O'Neill, who says that at least in those areas that are really important, maybe it's a good idea. Fine, we could talk about that, but even more important is literally that more wide collective and stakeholder governance of companies that are really benefiting so massively by these public funds. Again, very different if they were just making kind of luxurious little things on their own that didn't matter and that weren't being co-financed. So again, really happy to engage with you further. Also after this conference, we're working very actively in this area. We'll be putting together a larger international project, really focused on those 4 different ways to think about the problems and the solutions, the kind of HARPA type model, but also engaging quite actively with that kind of that higher level issue of mission-oriented policies. What does it look like to have a public goal, to be very concrete with it, but wide enough to welcome lots of different types of experimentation and to use the huge budgets for procurement to really drive that through? And coming back to that first point I made on innovation and the welfare state, what does it look like when those conversations become much more joined up? That's it.
So does anybody have any questions for Professor Mazzucato?
Did Jeremy Corbyn really say he was going to nationalise?
What was interesting?
Clarify on that point.
It's funny because I used to be I'm currently working quite actively also with the current government, helping Greg Clark make a mission-oriented industrial strategy, but I was an advisor for Corbyn, then resigned after Brexit, and it was interesting how the key points he took out from the entrepreneurial state was, oh, there's all this public money, then we should nationalize the private sort of healthcare system. There was a short thing that he and McDonald had written about this. And I said, no, actually what you need is a much better deal for your public funds. In the same way that in rail, the problem was not that, Richard Branson and others entered an area that had lots of public money. It was the complete lack of conditions on the level of reinvestment, maintaining, creating a green, sustainable transport system versus nationalizing the rail system.
Yeah, my feeling is that, there is a case for doing drug discovery in the public sector, direct public sector. Of course, everything's ultimately funded by the taxpayer, one way or another. But the key thing is to define which areas it will be. And certainly with the emissions, we need some detail. What is the mission? So Chinese putting a module on the far side of the moon, that cost X tens of billions. That's very clear. And as I said, we might be to cure the world of TB, or it might be to monitor health. But I think you've got to be specific about what the goals are.
That's where you want to keep it wide enough so it's the metrics, the implementation issues are what you're talking about, but to have a really clear goal that goes beyond, so for example, in the area of climate change, it's not just to clean up the oceans, it's to get the plastic out, a certain percentage of the plastic in a particular period of time. There's no reason why you can't say 90% removal of plastics in the ocean. That would require lots of different types of innovation in both the materials going in as well as how to get this stuff out. But that kind of public goal is how lots of public agencies think. In the area of health, for some reason, we have lots of public money, but not really clear public goals. How you then implement it, which is what you're talking about, which bits then of the whole wide innovation system, production system is actually private versus public, or how they're interrelating, that's sort of a secondary issue. It's not.
Yeah, and just comment on the Me Too drugs thing, because I think it's really important to use that precisely. Because if you're taking a drug for TB, for example, for whatever it is, 6 months, and you can cut by a small change in that drug, you can cut the amount of time you're taking the drug. That's a really important thing, and the structures may look very similar. Or the evolution of antibiotics, for example. People might say it's Me Too, but they've changed the world. The evolution of antibiotics following from the discovery of penicillins.
Yeah, the problem is not just that there exist Me Too drugs. It's if you look at the percentage of private pharmaceutical funding in the innovation system going to the Me Too area is much higher than it used to be. There used to be pre sort of 1980 larger sharing of the risks also in the kind of more pathway. So the new molecular entities with priority rating, something like 75% of that money is coming from public sources, which is fine, but then you'd question, why is the price system not reflecting that of those blockbuster drugs?
But the reason the first generation hepatitis C protease inhibitors didn't succeed was because the next generation were better. Is that a Me Too drug or not? I don't know. So you want people working in that kind of field for many decades. Yeah.
So would you admit, though, that there's lots of different actors that are, really important for things like, hepatitis C drugs, and the price of that drug should reflect that collective value creation process versus just focusing on the importance of the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, I think it's context, as Jeremy said, I think it's context dependent. So you've got to be precise about the area. I was saying before, I think it's totally wrong to be a specific. Biogen have made tens of billions out of fumarate esters for MS and Parkinson's, whatever. They've in a combination therapy, they've now discovered that a single part of that is discovered inverted commas. A single part is the active entity, and they've repatented that. I don't think that's wrong. Right. I think that.
You don't think that's right, or you don't think that's wrong?
Right. I don't think that's right. I think it's wrong.
Yeah, so patenting something that's not really new is what's wrong. It's not making that thing that's not new. It's
the key
so
thing
if
is
it's not really new,
serves
exactly
the good, and that goes back. A lot of it goes back to initiatives in the US to promote research in new cancer drugs. The way the patents are currently constructed.
That's a great talk. Thank you. So there's another aspect where there's like the Tencents, the Googles, and the Amazons that own all of this data. That's their data that is going to be monetized, and you could potentially monetize it in healthcare. How does that fit into a model whereby you're talking about a public good, whereas they're providing free services theoretically? And so it's a bit of a whole new model, which is looking at a different way of generating insights from their own private investment. And how does that fit into some of the things you've spoken about?
So I think it fits in two ways. First, I'd recommend you read, if you're interested in that particular issue, the new book by Shoshana Zuboff called Surveillance Capitalism. So she says, it's not that you're searching Google for free, Google searching you for free. I mean, the amount of monetization every time you click is massive. But one of the issues is if you just look at it as a public good or a market failure again problem, then that's precisely when you get kind of too little too late, and at best you get the Competition Commission worrying about taxation or issues around privacy, which are becoming huge in terms of the kind of data that the companies actually have. But the real question, which you were kind of insinuating, is why do these companies even have the data in the first place? The technology to retrieve the data, all publicly financed, internet, GPS, and the data is of the citizens, public meaning citizenry in the Aristotelian sense. And so there are ways that one could rethink the governance, coming to the fourth point, of where this data even goes in the first place. So the city of Barcelona is actually experimenting with that. So every time you click on City Mapper in Barcelona, the data normally would just go to private companies. They're looking at different governance mechanisms and literally collectively governed repositories of data that go back to a new type of institution that actually doesn't exist yet, which would also be funneled right into the improvement of public transport, as opposed to being in the companies and then us trying to either limit what access they have. So I actually think we have an institutional, organizational innovation problem, new structures, as opposed to just assuming that it's right for the companies to be having access to this data. It could be the opposite. For them to have access to the data, they would have to agree on certain conditions, pay potentially into a fee that generates the next generation of GPSs. Why not? I mean, what would Uber be without GPS? What would Google be without the internet? Nothing. That was tax paid.
Mariana, this is probably a dumb question, but so I've often thought that, so let's accept the figures of it roughly takes 2 billion to generate a new drug. So I could conceive...
I went to Tufts and I don't agree with that.
Okay, well, whatever, right. Yeah. But so let's assume that we could create a pot of 10 billion. And we say to, Stephen, Niven, Chris, here's 10 billion. Now go away and come up with a new generation of antibiotics in the next 10 years. Now, I think that is doable. I think if we put that sort of 10 billion in, we will come up with a new generation of antibiotics in the next decade. Why are we not doing it? I mean, I was surprised this morning when Jeremy Farrar said that the governments, the charities, including Wellcome and Gates, etc., they don't have aggregate funds that are sufficient to do that. I mean, I think it's a moonshot type goal. I think that's exactly what we should be doing. I buy your narrative about sort of, it's often government funds that create these platforms that enable industry, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I absolutely believe it's doable. I keep hearing that we need the pharmaceutical industry involved. I actually think we don't, because every skill set that sits inside the pharmaceutical industry now sits outside the pharmaceutical industry. It's just a question of critical mass of funding.
Yeah. So I agree with you 100%. And that's exactly what we're trying to argue through that kind of HARPA type of model, which would be precisely, as DARPA said, here's a certain amount of money, who's going to come up with the problem? What was the problem? Getting the satellites to communicate. They didn't necessarily do it themselves, but they set out the problem, and other actors came up with something that eventually became ARPANET and the internet. That is the model that you're suggesting. The problem is the amount of lobbying, the amount of power relationships that are getting in the way. 10 billion is nothing compared to the profits being earned by the pharmaceutical industry by conning, gaming the system. So that's where I think it is also a question of confidence. You can't just say this is a better policy, a different model. What is the implications of that model for literally kind of some of the issues that you were talking about, who's doing what at what point. But, GSK, I think there is someone from GSK here, right? Is that right? Who are you?
Yeah.
Hiya. So, and I've talked to Patrick Valance a lot about this, but I was struck, and it's not even GSK's fault, to be honest, it's government's fault, how they were completely conned into this really stupid thing called the patent box. Patents are 20-year monopolies from a public sector point of view. Forget the private sector, which can negotiate, can try to get whatever it wants. From a public sector point of view, it makes no sense to reduce the tax on a 20-year monopoly profit. Just that patent box in the UK is ridding government of £8 billion of funds, the degree to which it's actually incentivizing more money to be reinvested back into the system from the pharmaceutical industry, from what I understand from others who really looked at this very specifically, is negligible. So the fact that the patent box increases profits of the sector, but not necessarily the reinvestment, and definitely not in the investment of the kind of things we want, is a huge public sector failure. I actually don't blame Glaxo for lobbying it through. I blame the government for being so idiotic for buying into the story that they were told to by Glaxo.
But what I can't understand
And that's money that they're earning by not having the system that you're proposing.
But what I can't understand is, after Jim O'Neill's report 4 years ago, he said, today, 700,000 people a year are dying across the planet because they're resistant to antibiotics. 2050, that's going to be 10 million. If we don't come up with a new generation of antibiotics, it's going to cost the planet 100 trillion in GDP.
But you could do the same thing with climate change. The cost of not doing something is greater than the cost of...
But how much more data do we need? How do we make this happen?
So, I'm sure you have much more intelligent answers here in the room, but for me, the reason it's not happening is very illuminating. And so the kind of propositions that we're putting forward, we think fundamentally change these relationships, both in terms of the governance, the hold on this narrative of value-based pricing, which is really, again, just a story made up, somehow believed, and this constant thing, which is you're not going to have innovation if all this isn't done through the price system, because you're basically suggesting a price scheme that is completely false. And what you need is data, but especially look at other sectors which have been much more innovative in some ways, or just as innovative, let's just say, so pharmaceutical sector, where you didn't have to have, the current system that you have in pharmaceuticals to drive innovation. But there might be some areas that actually you wouldn't want to be, mission-oriented, but what you've just described is definitely doable, and you just need a serious kind of evidence-based attack on the false stories that are not allowing it to happen. By the way, when Obama did Obamacare, you'll remember he was told, stop meddling in our health care. What he should have done was not just the classic social democratic response, which is, but there's 60 million people uninsured and they're going to die if they don't have this, the kind of the fairness point. He should have really attacked it on the creation point. Meddling in your healthcare when 75% of the new molecular entities with priority rating are fundamentally co-financed by the public sector. We have the right to make sure those goods reach the population. And that's just for the drugs that actually exist. What you're talking about are things like antibiotics that don't even exist, that would be fine in an area that didn't have this massive public and charity expense. And the fact they don't do what you're saying, I do think is a narrative story and framework problem. And you just have to get much more confidence, not you, but the system needs to change its power relationships.
Hi, yes. The share buybacks, 3 trillion or whatever, the share buying back in the pharmaceutical sector. This kind of is just a reminder of the cookie crazy economy, global economy we're living in at the moment, because you've got companies that are like Apple building up great cash piles and just not finding ways to actually spend it. And you've got other companies doing these big share buybacks. It's partly because they just, for some reason, in spite of all the new technologies and everything coming along, they just can't find some way. There's just not something investable there. They can't find, there's something not working there that 3 trillion goes back into the shares to boost the share prices. But it's also a function of there's something not working right in the global economy. And it's not just in this sector, it's in lots of sectors and in the Western economy, actually. Not enough demand, not enough something or other. Because that could be doing something creative. And it's 30 or 40 times the 10 that we just discussed.
So Apple didn't use
take us through this a little bit, and in terms of the bigger picture, the bigger vision and the future, what's the vision piece that Jeremy was talking about this morning, the bone that he dangled, the vision piece.
Yeah, unfortunately I wasn't here.
That could unlock some of this and say, well, if they're not going to use it, then we should. If they're not going to invest, then something like this. What's your take?
So first of all, I don't think the us versus them thing necessarily works, because it's definitely in every sector, whether it's digital or pharma, you need all the different actors to kind of play their bit, and how they do it at which point, which context is, of course, extremely important. But if you talk to the biggest share buybackers, and Exxon, Pfizer, and Cisco are the three top ones, they will all say what you've just said, which I know you were sort of disagreeing with, but this idea that there aren't any opportunities for investment, this is the right thing to do. So first of all, of course, there's opportunities, right? The ones that you were just mentioning is an opportunity. The degree to which they are benefiting from a system, which is fundamentally a social system, a system of innovation, without feeling the pressure, but no one's asking them to. That was the kind of Glaxo thing. It's not Glaxo's fault. There's no system asking Glaxo to come up with a different story, is the problem. So, Apple, under Steve Jobs, didn't do any share buybacks. It's a corporate governance issue. Tim Cook's big plan is basically the 100 billion share buyback scheme. There is, by the way, there are lots of articles about Apple and its kind of, lack of innovation. It's just tinkering with different numbers of the iPhone. It hasn't come up with the big new, alternative or next big wave of innovation. That's not just a new number for the iPhone. That's not unrelated to its corporate governance structure. Cisco itself used to be sort of an innovation machine. The degree of financialization it has today, where over 100% of its net income is used as either share buybacks or dividend payouts, so it's actually going into its capital reserves, is not unrelated to the lack of innovation in Cisco, or relative innovation. So, companies like Pfizer, who are also engaging with these massive share buybacks, the issue is, if you really were this sole actor in the system, who cares? Let them do what they want. Who are we or anyone? Who has the right to tell Pfizer what to do with its money? Given the massive benefits it's receiving from what I'm describing as a collective system of value co-creation, that's where the problem is. So the vision, that's why I began with all the kind of visionary words, not market fixing, but market co-creating, co-shaping, not just de-risking, but sharing risk, sharing rewards. There's actually, at least within economics, and I'm an economist, sorry for that, no framework for that. There literally is, value is created inside companies. What governments can do is facilitate that through science-industry linkages or redistribute that value through taxation. We ourselves don't even have the terms for public value or public purpose. These are just kind of fuzzy little words that business schools might use in kind of, flaky ways, but it's not actually within the economic framework. So the Treasury, when it evaluates public investment, whether it's the National Institutes of Health or the BBC in this country, it's quite striking what happens time after time is they say, oh, it's fine to do that little bit, which is the public good. So to the BBC, they say, it's fine to do documentaries about giraffes in Africa. It's fine to do high quality news. Why are you doing soap operas and talk shows? That's for business. And if you do that, you're crowding out business. That same accusation of you're crowding out, as soon as you have real ambition, in the BBC would be nothing had it not had ambitions around public value in areas like soap operas, where they weren't doing the Dynasty and the Dallas, but EastEnders, stories about basically, lower income people. That's what the vision piece is. So if you are going to have a lot of public money in public health kind of pots, whether it's NIH or MRC, what is it we're actually striving to do? Are you just funding that bit of the research that's not being funded by the private sector? Or you do have a real debate internally about achieving public value, public return for public investment, where it's not just a monetary return, but also what it is that we're actually co-creating. It's not unrelated, this level of, again, insecurity of these organizations to these frameworks. And so in the case in the US, the NIH should be redefining the market itself, not just plowing all that money into just drugs, right? So that's the Abrams point that we talked about in the report, which is, there should be lots of money also going into healthy living, diagnostic, surgical treatments, as much as drugs, but somehow we've accepted the definition of the market defined by the pharmaceutical industry, and then we fix the public good problem inside with basic research. And no mission-oriented funding of that DARPA style of saying, that's what we want to solve. Here's 10 billion, as you were suggesting, solve it. How you do it, up to you. Soviet top-down system doesn't work, we know that. But instead of buying into the story of Big Pharma saying, oh, if you do that, it stunts innovation, no, we can solve it. I mean, it has worked in other sectors. It's not easy, but it can be done. But the lobbying efforts against what you're suggesting are massive.
Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to raise one point as we have the industrial people here. So it may well be that GSK and other companies are unfairly subsidized by the taxpayer. But from my perspective, they do invest a lot of money in research in ways that, say, for example, the banking or cigarette industries don't do. So ultimately, it all comes from public source, and I completely disagree with you slightly, Chaz. I think we'd be insane not to build on the expertise in the large pharmaceutical companies to, for example, to eradicate TB from the planet. I think is a realistic aim within 20 years, and it shouldn't.
But the pharmaceutical industry hasn't done it. They're making mega profits from constantly feeding back this thing of you're going to stunt innovation if the pharmaceutical industry isn't sort of directing the show. Of course, we need a pharmaceutical industry, and of course they're playing their part. But the degree of rewards they're earning from a system where a lot of other actors are putting in huge amounts of money is nonsense. And in some ways, I would say the financial sector has been more honest. In some ways, I mean, the venture capitalists at least only take 20%.
A different discussion, but the financial crisis, an awful lot of taxpayers' money went into the
financial crisis, the scam. I mean, part of it. There's many problems with finance. I was kind of being facetious, but finance has many problems. One of which is finance has just been financing finance. So only 10% of banking funds in the UK go back to the real economy. Most goes into finance, insurance, and real estate. When the government bailed them out, we literally socialized the risks but privatized the rewards. When Goldman Sachs made record level profits the year after they were bailed out, where were the rewards just went private? But I would argue that's exactly what we have with the pharmaceutical industry. Socialization of risk, privatization of rewards. Of course, Big Pharma is doing lots, but the degree of rewards that are being earned by a system that's fundamentally much more collective than what they're admitting is obscene, as much as the banks.
Mariana, thank you so much for the great talk. So I'm just thinking about how the society is actually moving forward with the population becoming more and more educated because it's much easier to get access to information. And still we're talking about the government, if you like, deciding for the entire society. Now thinking about with all this regulation. So thinking about the challenges that you mentioned, for instance, the moonshot, I think that's a great idea, but only big groups that have big pockets can run for those. Would you agree? No. And I'm just thinking, if I'm a small innovator, a small group, SME, 2-3 people, but that can have transformation idea, how can those smaller groups be organically built into this larger narrative of big challenge?
It's a really, really good question, and that's why, again, another free report. Just Google missions, European Commission, and my surname, the report will come up. So the examples that I give here, and this was written with the whole team, for example, with the plastics, the idea is that, first of all, there's 3 points. One is the mission itself should be defined with different actors at the table. It's not the Kennedy top-down thing, going to the moon and back again, right? It should definitely, the smaller companies, the charities, stakeholder groups should be at the table defining the missions themselves. Whether Europe does that or not, we'll see, but it's very clearly written here that it should be. We're writing a new report called Governing Missions. But currently what's happening with the SMEs, small, medium enterprises, is really foolish. We're just throwing money at them. In this country, direct and indirect funds for SMEs is more than we spend on universities. It's 9 billion. So Alan Hughes at Cambridge, just look at his a report on that. Now, I'm not against SMEs. That would be really stupid. Only about 6% of SMEs even care to innovate, right? There's a whole Nesta report on that. Those companies that want to innovate and are small need that extra support, right? But you don't just fund them because they're small. Some companies are small actually because they're pretty crappy. They're not innovative. They're not productive. They don't even want to innovate. So what is small? You might want to fund them for folkloric reasons, but it has nothing to do with innovation or the economy. Those companies that are small who want to innovate and who are interested in helping to achieve these kind of public missions, by public I mean, again, co-defined, will not only need extra support because they're small, but the number of projects, there's just some listed here for the plastic-free ocean, for carbon neutral cities, for decreasing the burden of dementia, the types of bottom-up projects which would be cross-sectoral to fuel innovation towards that mission, which is addressing a challenge. If you look at the examples, they are, lots of them are around service, around new ways to use big data, around all sorts of new ways to think about the interactions between materials and anyway, there's lots of examples there. There's no reason that small or startups, small companies or startups wouldn't be part of that bottom-up experimentation. In fact, they tend to be better at experimenting and exploring. So if the model is a publicly co-created mission that is going to be intersectoral with the procurement budgets, prize schemes to fuel the bottom-up experimentation, chances are it's going to be the smaller bottom-up adaptable, flexible ones that will be able to propose stuff. But they need that extra support, but not because they're SMEs. We need to get rid of startup policy, get rid of SME policy, get mission-oriented policy that really helps those small, funky, creative companies tackle these interesting sort of challenges. Otherwise, you get Silicon Roundabout, which, no comment. Or Cambridge. I mean, is anyone here from Cambridge, or is this Oxford? I mean, huge amount of money going into a spin-out machine. Most of them are irrelevant. Some are good, but if you compare to how much money went in to make a university create spin-outs, it's mad. Silicon Valley, Stanford never had a spin-out policy, right? I mean, I always say, if you want spin-outs, just buy them in from California if that's your big plan. But the whole innovation system that worked really dynamically in the US that got us Silicon Valley was never obsessed with spin-outs. In the same way that they never worried about the internet, it was a solution to a problem. The spillover was the internet.
Public-private partnerships.
You don't like spin-outs?
I was applauding the comments on Cambridge.
No, but the funny thing is gazelles. You know the word gazelle?
No.
Oh, you haven't heard the word gazelle? This is like the trendy word in the innovation world. What is a gazelle? It's this animal that sits there eating grass, then all of a sudden sprints really fast and then gets eaten by a lion. And it's like, and we use this word gazelle to mean like fast, cool, innovative, small companies. And it's like, I mean, even the like animals that they've chosen to symbolize them make no sense. But
Well, anyway, if there are no more,
any
more questions?
A question about private-public partnerships. They seem to be increasing exponentially lately in healthcare, and there's so many examples, and I think they're becoming so popular because people believe that there's value in this, but I don't have evidence about it, I don't have data, but what seems to happen is this equation is massively skewed towards the private rather than public, and how does public benefit, and is this actually a mistaken path that we're taking that actually prevents all those missions that you are talking about, or do you think there's a future behind that?
So again, I think there's a time issue, so I'll be super quick. First, every time I use the word, partnerships or ecosystems, I'll often have a biologist who says, sorry, what? Is it a predatory? Is it parasitic? Is it symbiotic? Ecosystem. So in this world of innovation and economics interaction with it, we've just used the word ecosystem and partnerships as though it's necessarily a good thing without ever having metrics for capturing the degree to which we have mutualistic, symbiotic partnerships in ecosystem versus predator-prey, parasitic. I'll just say that without mentioning the word big pharma. Okay, but what's interesting is it's not that you don't want the private sector involved, it's kind of who's directing the show. And I often look at space, literally outer space, to look at how problematic the situation is. So you have this publicly funded infrastructure called the ISS, International Space Station, which is now interacting with these different private actors, like Novartis. So in order to show its relevance to the economy, NASA has in recent years been forced to come up with these kind of inane policies which show the economic value on Earth, like day 2 of your investment, which again would have never gotten them to the moon had they thought that way. And they went to the pharmaceutical industry and said, oh, look, there's a space station that we want you to interact with. And they were like, yeah, well, what do we do on that? Not interested. Oh, but in zero gravity environment, cancer cells grow and it'd be really cool. Come, play with us. Like, all right, but only if we can patent. No, you can't patent because, it's a publicly funded thing and you can go up there for free in the sense that astronauts will do your experiments. Well, then we're not interested. Okay, fine, you can patent. It's like literally the most ridiculous situation. And even with Elon Musk, when Justin Bieber goes out to space and unfortunately comes back down, the full cost of his ticket, not a penny, goes back into that public infrastructure. But so we're repeating in space exactly what we did on Earth. And what we need is a really frank conversation of, it's not a problem that Elon Musk is up there, but first of all, and this is the last point, SpaceX itself, literally the skills that they hired in came from NASA. So the more we outsource ambition, mission, a possibility to dream the big stuff, which is what you were just doing. You were dreaming a big thing. You also get hemorrhaging of talent. What I've observed in NASA, and we just did a report for them, is hemorrhaging of the best people. It's like, what, I'm just there to de-risk Elon Musk? See ya. I'll either go to Goldman Sachs and do their derivative models or go back to Stanford. And there's this real risk that when we don't get this kind of real, again, new narrative, new vision, we end up getting a hemorrhaging of talent, of expertise, of ambition, of confidence from these public institutions that go into the private sector. And it's not the private sector's fault, right? I mean, we've set up the system in a really problematic way. But the partnerships, I mean, the PFI schemes are, again, another big scam, and there were different ways to do that. And the problem is not the existence of the private sector in the healthcare system, it's how they ended up directing the show.
Oh, yes.
So,
GSK.
Oh dear.
GSK, so I've sat here, hearing pharma bashing for the last half an hour. And I'm just wondering what the alternative will be, and I hope you think about it a little bit when you're giving your sick kids their medicine this afternoon.
Well, most is publicly financed. So.
75% of the funding from government is not the same as 25% from industry going into developing a medicine. It's the underpinning stuff that's doing all that good stuff, skills development. It's not just solely driven to making a medicine. Okay, so it's kind of a little bit different, and it's also in part, of course, coming from the taxes that companies like GSK are already paying. And it's a little bit disingenuous to say that we're only picking on the lucrative end of the business when, for as long as I can remember, we've been working in TB. It's a hard nut to crack. Malaria is a hard nut to crack. We tap into the academic base, of course we do. We need their lateral thinking, and we need the project drive of pharma. We know pharma's not that successful. We know we've got to change the model. But I haven't heard you say anything that I would think is going to flip things and change things overnight to develop new medicines at a cheaper cost.
Well, the report is all about that, so at this point I can just tell you to read it, but the narrative that you just, repeated, I hear at every single conference, and I think people, frankly, and this isn't meant to be disrespectful to you or to GSK, which I think is actually, of the pharmaceutical companies, the least dysfunctional also in terms of the share buyback problem, but it's not about saying, oh, but you're just blaming pharma or you're, what was the word you just said, pharma bashing. That's not the point. The point is the degree of profitability when the drugs succeed, are obscene compared to the whole social system that went into, including the big pharma research, right, that went into developing those drugs. So if you really think that, the 54 billion profit for a drug that was heavily publicly financed is fine, then fine. But there's a risk-reward mismatch, which is not to say to blame big pharma. I actually think a lot of the problem is the state, how it's been bought into because of the stories, though, they hear, which you just very quickly
But we've had run-ins in the past, as you'll probably remember. The share buyback doesn't influence the amount of money that goes into R&D.
Well, the total is 61%.
So when we are talking...
61% is the share buybacks compared to R&D.
So if you have a look
That's pretty high.
at the national statistics figures and the spend on R&D across all the sectors in the UK, it's between 20 and 25% is coming from pharma. Okay, so, and we talk about 2.4% by 2027 of GDP. We're already in low teens. So I don't know what else, I genuinely do not know what else we're supposed to do.
But that's why I wasn't just talking about the amount. I talked about direction. I mean, the fact that there's, look, I don't want to do the whole presentation again. What you're saying is not wrong. Like, in other words, it's not that we want to get rid of big pharma. Hence my point about it's not just about nationalizing the pharmaceutical industry. That would be insane. It's about getting a more functional relationship. So if you think there's a functional relationship, then you shouldn't worry about anything I said. If you think that there's actually a risk-reward problem, so that when drugs that are incredibly profitable are being, the prices are just way too high, given what the division of innovative labor actually was in that sector, then we should at least raise these questions. How to solve it, of course it's complicated, but there are many complicated things society has done.
Anchor stuff here in the United Kingdom.
Sorry?
I would. You need those. You need the, frankly, the patent box stuff. It's more about the message than it is about, frankly, about the money, for my part. I mean, you're gonna have.
But Pfizer picked up from Sandwich, Kent, and went near Boston, not because of tax. They wanted to be closer to very big pots of, NIH kind of spending. It wasn't because there was a better tax system. I mean, listen to Warren Buffett. He's always like, stop reducing my tax. I don't give a shit. I invest where there's an opportunity. So everything I'm talking about is let's really invest, co-invest together on the new opportunities, and not use there's no opportunities as a reason to do the share buybacks, and not to kind of bring in capital just by a race to the bottom with patent box type policies, which are really a scam. I don't know anyone who knows anything about innovation who supports it. It's the one thing almost every, in the economics community, the one thing that I've found that no one disagrees with in the economics community for once. But the Institute for Fiscal Studies put the report out on just what a scam it was. And just get rid of it. Use that money to do your billion prize game. Why not? So,